The Sphinx and the pyramids link up to form a gigantic astronomical hologram of the skies above Egypt around the year 10,500 BC. In that epoch, and only in that epoch, the key celestial bodies are represented with faultless accuracy, viewed from every conceivable angle and direction. When we remember the uncanny precision with which the pyramid builders worked, it's impossible to ascribe such interlocking complexity to coincidence. What we have here is a massive and deliberate time marker for the epoch of 10,500 BC, almost 8,000 years before Egyptian civilization is supposed to have begun.
Other evidence supports that date, particularly the type of erosion found on the Sphinx. John West believes it was caused not by sand, but by water, and he says the evidence was there all along.
Well, nobody was looking for it. It's a bit like if you're looking for potatoes, you can walk right through a field full of diamonds and see a lot of nasty, glittering stones. So the geology was simply taken for granted. Nobody looked for it, nobody found it.
West's conclusion is based on the Sphinx's extremely distinctive pattern of weathering.
You don't even have to be a geologist to look at it and see what must have been responsible for that kind of weathering. Only water pouring in sheets over the enclosure wall could have produced those rounded contours.
Though the exact age of any stone is difficult to determine, a history of the rock can be constructed by looking at the characteristics of its erosion. When stone is exposed to wind and sand, the layers will appear soft and scoured out. This kind of erosion is very common in Giza. But the Sphinx and its surrounding pit are worn differently. They show a different kind of erosion altogether. A round, undulating profile, usually caused by rainwater and torrential downpours. When confronted with this evidence, Egyptologists deduced that the flooding of the Nile would have caused the damage. But John West disagrees.
No, absolutely not, because the Nile floods would come in from the bottom, and if it had been flooding by Nile waters, you'd have a different pattern of erosion. You'd have the walls undercut. In other words, you'd have the deepest erosion at the bottom, not at the top. And you also wouldn't get those deep fissures.
John West's findings raise many questions. In the ensuing debate, geologists side with him, but Egyptologists have so far offered little response to his conclusions. Journalist Paul Roberts.
West is really an academic's worst nightmare, because here comes somebody way out of left field with a thoroughly well thought out, well presented, coherently described, beautifully written, full of data you can't refute, and it pulls the rug from beneath your feet. So how do they deal with it? They ignore it. They hope it'll go away. And it won't go away.
Evidence of repair work on the Sphinx seems to lend credence to West's theory.
Here we're looking at a section of the earliest repairs. You see that some 2 to 3 feet of repair blocks were necessary in order to bring the Sphinx back to its original contours. We're told that these repairs were done within 300 years of the original carving of the Sphinx. Now the question arises, why would 3 feet of repairs be necessary over the course of just some 300 years? Egyptologists insist that the stone the Sphinx is carved from is of such poor quality that it weathered away 3 feet in just 300 years. This presents another problem. If the stone the Sphinx is carved from is of such poor quality, and the Sphinx was carved 4,500 years ago, it means that at the erosion rate of a foot a century, the Sphinx would have disappeared some 500 years ago. Well, it hasn't.
Even if repairs were made because of water damage, a major question remains unanswered. When was there water in the desert? The answer is surprising. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age.
This was a time in the history of mankind when the earth was passing through an unprecedented upheaval. a tremendous cataclysm was taking place in the Earth 12,500 years ago. This was the end of the last ice age. There had been 50 or 60,000 years of relatively stable conditions with millions of square miles of ice covering the northern hemisphere. And suddenly, for reasons that no scientist has yet fully fathomed out, all of this ice melted in a span of just 2,000 to 3,000 years.
The ice cap that covered northern Europe and America at this time was 2 miles thick. The melting was sudden and widespread, and it produced flooding of biblical proportions. Egyptologist Tekra Hassan explains.
Egypt experienced major and dramatic changes at the end of the Ice Age, particularly about 10,500 BC, when very high, exceptionally high floods covered the floodplain and ended things both in the Delta and the Nile Valley in general.
John West expands his theory.
I think the history of the Sphinx goes something like this. Long ago, before Egypt became desert, the Giza Plateau was a fertile savanna. At its very edge was a large outcrop of natural rock. An unknown group of sculptors, taking advantage of its prominent position, carved the rock into a giant face. May have been the face of a god, or of a lion. Time passed. Shifting weather patterns brought torrential rain to the area, signaling the end of the Ice Age. The rains weathered the lion to virtually the shape we see today. When the rain stopped, the once fertile savanna turned into Sahara Desert. The wind-blown sands buried the statue up to its neck, for thousands of years, protecting the body and its telltale traces of water weathering. What about the face? Still eroding away, diminishing in size. Possibly it was recarved. Certainly the 4th dynasty kings who built the pyramids around 2500 BC uncovered the Sphinx and further fashioned the face in their image. Pharaoh Khephren didn't build the Sphinx, he restored it.
As further proof of their theories, John West and his fellow investigators point to another structure they believe could date back to 10,000 BC. It too shows unmistakable signs of being weathered by vast amounts of water. It was discovered at Abydos in the early 20th century, buried under sand.
Here, some 500 miles south of Giza, at the Osirion, we find ourselves amidst another of those enigmatic, anonymous structures that seem to date to no known epoch. 50 feet or more below the floor of surrounding pharaonic temples. Is it possible that this is just one amongst many structures like this buried beneath the sands of Egypt? Later pharaohs came and added their reliefs to these walls, but originally this structure was anonymous and bare, left for future generations to interpret.
Those who hold unorthodox views about the Giza Plateau find further confirmation in the Egyptian creation myth. Robert Bovell explains.
Every civilization refers to a creation myth, a beginning. But the Egyptians were extremely clear about what had happened in the beginning. They tell us the earth was totally covered with water, and that the physical, the material earth sprang out of the water, and we had a primeval mound on which creation began, on which there was the first dawn, the first sunrise. It's as if, for example, the king who built those pyramids was reenacting that moment, that time of the gods. It would be normal for them to want to commemorate it, to freeze it, if you like, in a grandiose expression. I think if there is the original primeval mound, that's it, Giza. Indeed, the texts refer to the place of Giza, of Heliopolis, as being the location of creation. Perhaps we should take them literally. They tell us that this is the place of creation. And what else we would expect of that fantastic moment of creation than monuments of this sort to commemorate?